The morning sun cast sharp shadows through the pristine windows of Ashford galleries, illuminating dust motes that danced like suspended gilt in the climate-controlled air. Victoria Ashford stood before her prized possession, a 1920s Steinway Model D, black as midnight and positioned in the gallery's main window like a predator displaying its kill. At 38, she had perfected the art of looking down on people even when they stood at eye level, her blonde hair pulled into a chignon so tight it seemed to stretch her features into a permanent expression of disdain. "Absolutely not," she said into her phone, her manicured fingers drumming against the piano's closed lid. "I don't care if the insurance company recommended him. I'm not having some person from the streets touching my Steinway." The piano had been silent for 3 weeks. A broken string, the middle C, had snapped during a private viewing, the sharp crack echoing through the gallery like a gunshot. Since then, the instrument had sat mute, its silence somehow more accusatory than any sound it had ever produced. Victoria had called every reputable restoration service in Manhattan, but they all quoted the same astronomical figures: minimum $3,000 for emergency service, $5,000 if she wanted it done properly. "Mrs. Ashford, I understand your concerns," came the tinny voice of her insurance adjuster, "but Marcus Chen is actually quite qualified. His references are impeccable, and his rate is, frankly, unusually reasonable." Victoria's laugh was sharp enough to cut crystal. $50. Please. You get what you pay for in this city. I'd rather leave it broken than let some vagrant pretend to be a craftsman. She ended the call with the satisfaction of someone who had just prevented a disaster. Through the gallery window, she could see the morning foot traffic beginning to build, tourists clutching coffee cups, early commuters in their pressed suits, and the usual collection of Manhattan's invisible people, delivery workers, street cleaners, and the homeless who somehow always found ways to make themselves seen. Victoria's assistant, a nervous young man named James with wire-rimmed glasses and a tendency to stutter when stressed, approached with a clipboard. "Ma'am. The Pavel Kozlov pieces arrived this morning. They're in the back room for authentication." A different kind of smile crossed Victoria's face, predatory, satisfied. Pavel Kozlov was her most reliable partner, a master forger who could reproduce anything from Renaissance paintings to modern sculptures with uncanny precision. The legitimate art world would be horrified to know that some of the pieces hanging in the most respected collections were Pavel's work, while the originals disappeared into private offshore accounts. "Excellent. Have them prepared for Thursday's opening. The Whitmore collection should fetch at least $2 million. James nodded and scurried away, leaving Victoria alone with her reflection in the piano's polished surface. She had inherited this gallery from her grandfather, along with a reputation that opened doors throughout Manhattan's cultural elite. What she hadn't inherited was the old man's ear for authenticity, a weakness she had learned to disguise with aggressive confidence and the kind of wealth that made people assume expertise. The truth was, Victoria Ashford was tone-deaf. She couldn't distinguish between a perfectly tuned piano and one with half its strings missing. But in her world, owning beautiful things mattered more than understanding them, and she had built an empire on that principle. Outside, the morning crowd was thickening. Victoria noticed a commotion near the Metropolitan Museum across the street, some sort of performance that was drawing a small crowd. Through the gallery window, she could see an old upright piano, its wood scarred and veneer peeling, positioned on the wide sidewalk. A man sat at the bench, his fingers moving across the keys with fluid precision. The music drifted through the traffic noise, somehow finding its way through the gallery's sealed windows. Victoria couldn't identify the piece, but something about it made her uncomfortable. It was too perfect, too controlled, played with the kind of technical mastery that suggested serious training. She moved to the window for a better view. The pianist was Asian, probably in his 50s, wearing clothes that had seen better decades. His black hair was streaked with premature gray, and his posture suggested someone who had once carried himself with considerable pride. Despite his obvious poverty, there was something in the way he held his shoulders, the precise economy of his movements, that spoke of refinement. A small crowd had gathered, dropping bills and coins into an open case at the piano's base. Victoria watched as a woman in an expensive coat, someone Victoria recognized from previous gallery openings, stopped to listen, then carefully placed a $20 bill among the donations. "Ridiculous," Victoria muttered. "Street performance should be regulated. This is supposed to be a respectable neighborhood." She turned away from the window, but the music continued, seeping into her consciousness despite her best efforts to ignore it. The melody was complex, layered, the kind of piece that required not just technical skill but deep musical understanding. For a moment, she found herself wondering who this man was, what had brought him to performing on street corners. Then her phone rang, shattering the moment. "Victoria, darling." The voice belonged to Margaret Sinclair, wife of a hedge fund manager and one of Victoria's most valuable clients. "I simply must have your opinion on something. Charles bought this ghastly modern piece at auction, and I need you to tell me it's worthless so I can convince him to return it." Victoria smiled, settling into her familiar role. "Of course, Margaret. Bring it by this afternoon. I'm sure we can find something more suitable for your collection." As she spoke, she moved away from the window, but the piano music followed her like a ghost. Even from the back office, she could hear it, precise, haunting, utterly professional. It made her think of her grandfather's stories about the great concert halls of Europe, about musicians who could make audiences weep with a single phrase. But that was ridiculous. This was just some homeless man who had probably learned a few pieces from YouTube videos. The idea that street musicians could possess real talent was absurd, a romantic notion that belonged in movies, not in the harsh reality of Manhattan economics. Victoria's intercom buzzed. "Ma'am." James's voice was even more nervous than usual. "There's someone here about the piano repair." "I already told the insurance company no," Victoria snapped. "I'm not interested in their budget recommendation." "Actually, ma'am, he's not from the insurance company. He says he heard about the broken piano and wanted to offer his services directly. He's quite insistent that he can fix it properly for $50. Victoria's blood pressure spiked. The audacity was breathtaking. "Send him away. Immediately." "I tried, ma'am, but he's very persistent. He says he can hear the problem from the street and knows exactly what needs to be done." Through the gallery window, Victoria could see that the street performance had ended. The sidewalk where the old piano had been was empty now, the crowd dispersed. A strange silence had settled over the neighborhood, as if something vital had been removed. "Fine," Victoria said, her voice ice cold. "Send him in. I'll deal with this personally." She straightened her suit jacket and checked her reflection in a conveniently placed mirror. Some people needed to be reminded of their place in the world's hierarchy, and Victoria Ashford had never been shy about providing that education. The man who entered her gallery was exactly what she had expected: shabby clothes, weathered hands, the unmistakable odor of someone who lived rough. But there was something in his eyes that she hadn't anticipated, a quiet intelligence that seemed to catalog every detail of the room with professional assessment. "Ms. Ashford," he said, his voice carrying the faint trace of an accent. "My name is Marcus Chen. I understand you have a piano in need of repair." Victoria looked him up and down with unconcealed distaste. "Mr. Chen, I think there's been a misunderstanding. This gallery specializes in instruments worth more than most people's homes. I'm not in need of amateur assistance." Marcus nodded slowly, his gaze moving past her to the silent Steinway. 1920s Model D. Beautiful instrument. From the harmonic distortion I can hear even when it's not being played. I'd say you have a broken string, middle C, probably the unison closest to the bridge. Simple repair, but it requires understanding the instrument's specific tension requirements. Victoria's mouth fell open slightly. The precision of his assessment was unsettling, but she quickly recovered her composure. Mr. Chen, I appreciate your enthusiasm, but this instrument requires the attention of certified professionals. Your $50 offer is frankly insulting. $50 for materials and labor, Marcus said quietly. I don't require profit from helping preserve beautiful music. Preserve? Victoria's laugh was sharp and dismissive. Mr. Chen, that piano is worth more than you'll earn in a lifetime. I'm not about to let someone of your circumstances experiment on it. Something flickered in Marcus's eyes, not anger, but a kind of profound sadness, as if he had heard these words before and knew exactly what they revealed about the speaker. I understand, he said simply. Forgive the intrusion, Ms. Ashford. I hope you find someone suitable for the task. He turned to leave, and Victoria felt a surge of satisfaction. Some people needed to learn their limitations, and she had just provided a valuable life lesson. But as Marcus reached the door, he paused and looked back at the silent piano. It's a shame, he said, almost to himself. An instrument like that, it knows when it's not truly appreciated. They always do. And then he was gone, leaving Victoria alone with her silent Steinway and a strange, uncomfortable feeling that she had just made a terrible mistake. Outside, the afternoon light was beginning to fade, and the gallery felt oddly hollow without the distant sound of street music. Victoria tried to return to her work, but found herself glancing repeatedly at the piano, its silence now seeming less like dignity and more like accusation. She didn't know that Marcus Chen was, at that very moment, sitting in his underground workshop, surrounded by salvaged piano parts and handwritten restoration notes, planning something that would change her life forever. She didn't know that the man she had just dismissed was about to orchestrate the most elaborate and devastating act of malicious compliance in Manhattan's cultural history. But the piano knew. The piano remembered. And soon, Victoria Ashford would discover that some mistakes echo long after the final note has been played. The abandoned subway maintenance tunnel beneath Central Park had been Marcus Chen's home for 3 years, 2 months, and 16 days. Not that anyone was counting except Marcus himself, who marked each dawn with a small pencil notation in a water-stained composition notebook. The space smelled of machine oil, damp concrete, and the peculiar metallic tang that came from decades of train wheels grinding against steel rails overhead. Elena Rodriguez descended the rusted ladder carefully, her legal briefcase slung across her shoulder and a small flashlight cutting through the perpetual twilight. She had been searching for Marcus for 2 years, following leads through homeless shelters, soup kitchens, and the informal networks that kept Manhattan's invisible population connected. Finding him had taken patience, persistence, and a $20 tip to a street musician who remembered seeing someone matching Marcus's description near the old maintenance entrance. Dar. Chen, she called softly into the shadows. The workshop that materialized in her flashlight beam was like discovering a master craftsman's studio in a cave. Piano parts hung from the ceiling with surgical precision, strings organized by gauge, hammers sorted by felt density, keys arranged in chromatic sequences. Workbenches lined the walls, covered with tools that belonged in a museum, antique tuning forks, hand-forged steel files, measuring devices whose purpose Elena could only guess at. And there, in the center of it all, sat Marcus Chen at a small table, carefully adjusting the action on what appeared to be a miniature piano mechanism. Ms. Rodriguez, he said without looking up from his work. I've been expecting you. Elena felt her breath catch. She had imagined this moment for months, but the reality of finding him was both exhilarating and heartbreaking. The man who had once restored instruments for the world's greatest concert halls was living like a subway hermit, his considerable talents reduced to fixing broken toys and salvaged parts. Dar. Chen, Marcus, I've been looking for you since the story broke. I never believed you damaged that errored piano. The evidence was too convenient, too clean. Marcus set down his tools and finally looked at her. His eyes held the kind of weariness that came from being systematically destroyed by people with more power than conscience. Evidence doesn't matter when the accusers have enough money to rewrite reality. Elena opened her briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. That's what I want to talk to you about. I've been investigating your case, and I think I know who framed you and why. For the first time since she'd arrived, Marcus showed real interest. He gestured to a second chair, a salvaged piece from what might have once been a luxury office, and Elena sat down, spreading documents across his work table. Viktor Petrov, she began, pulling out a photograph of a man in his 60s with sharp features and cold eyes. Russian oligarch, art collector, and according to my sources, someone who doesn't take professional disagreements well. Marcus nodded slowly. The errored restoration. He wanted me to remove the original soundboard and replace it with a modern composite. Said it would improve the instrument's projection. But you refused. I refused because it would have destroyed the piano's historical integrity. That 1850 error was one of only 12 ever made with that specific soundboard configuration. Removing it would have been like painting over the Mona Lisa to make the colors brighter. Elena pulled out another document, a financial record showing a payment of $500,000 from one of Petrov's shell companies to a private investigation firm. 3 days after you refused his request, this payment was made. 2 weeks later, that same firm discovered evidence that you had damaged another client's piano through negligence. Marcus studied the document, his expression growing darker. The surveillance footage that supposedly showed me using incorrect restoration techniques. Footage that was later found to be edited, but only after your reputation was destroyed and Petrov had found a more cooperative restorer. Elena pulled out a final document. Someone who removed the error's original soundboard and replaced it with modern materials, exactly as Petrov wanted. The silence that followed was broken only by the distant rumble of a train passing overhead. Marcus sat back in his chair, processing information that confirmed what he had suspected but never been able to prove. "Why are you telling me this now?" he asked finally. "Because Petrov is still operating. Because he's connected to other art crimes that are still happening. And because..." Elena hesitated, then continued, "Because I think we can prove everything." She pulled out her laptop and opened a series of photographs. These were taken yesterday outside Ashford Galleries. Recognize anyone? Marcus leaned forward, studying the images. They showed well-dressed people entering and leaving the gallery, but one figure in particular caught his attention, a man with distinctive facial features and an expensive coat. "That's Pavel Kozlov," Marcus said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Art forger, according to Interpol. Also, according to my sources, Petrov's current business partner in a very sophisticated operation involving stolen and forged artwork." Elena clicked to another image. "And this is Victoria Ashford, who appears to be their primary fence in Manhattan." Marcus studied the photograph of Victoria, remembering her dismissive tone from that morning, her casual cruelty disguised as social propriety. "She has a 1920s Steinway Model D in her gallery window." "I know. I've been watching the gallery for weeks, documenting who goes in and out, when packages are delivered, how their operation works." Elena paused, studying Marcus's expression. "But I need someone who understands the art world from the inside. Someone who knows how these high-end transactions really work. Someone who can get close to the operation without raising suspicion." Elena nodded. A homeless street musician wouldn't seem threatening to someone like Victoria Ashford. She'd never suspect that kind of person could pose any real danger to her business. Marcus stood and walked to one of his workbenches, running his fingers along a set of precision tools. You're asking me to go undercover. I'm asking you to help me catch the people who destroyed your life. And in the process, maybe we can destroy theirs. Marcus turned back to Elena, and she saw something new in his eyes, not just weariness, but a cold, calculating intelligence. What did you have in mind? Elena smiled, pulling out a detailed floor plan of Ashford Galleries. Victoria Ashford is planning a major exhibition opening next week. High-profile clients, expensive pieces, and according to my research, probably the biggest art fraud operation they've attempted so far. She spread the floor plan across the work table, pointing to various rooms and entrances. The gallery has sophisticated security, but they're not expecting someone to infiltrate their operation from the inside. Someone who could document their processes, gather evidence, maybe even access their private records. And you think Victoria would hire a homeless piano tuner? I think Victoria Ashford is exactly the kind of person who would hire cheap labor for her exhibition opening, especially if that labor came with a compelling sob story and references she doesn't bother to check thoroughly. Marcus studied the floor plan, his mind already working through possibilities. The Steinway in her window, it has a broken string. Middle C. Perfect. You approach her again, maybe with a different story this time. Perhaps you mention that you've done work for other galleries, that you understand the importance of having instruments properly maintained for important events. And while I'm repairing her piano, I document whatever illegal activities I observe. Elena nodded. We build a case systematically. Financial records, authentication documents, anything that proves their forgery operation. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, thinking through the implications. Then he walked to a filing cabinet, an ancient metal piece that looked like it had been salvaged from a government office, and pulled out a thick folder. MS. Rodriguez, he said, opening the folder to reveal detailed photographs and documentation, I think you should see something. The photographs showed the interior mechanisms of various pianos, but Elena quickly realized they were actually documenting something else entirely. Hidden in the images were details of authentication stamps, provenance documents, and what appeared to be financial records tucked inside piano cases. For the past 3 years, I've been documenting irregularities in the high-end musical instrument trade, Marcus explained. Stolen pieces being sold with forged documentation, authentic instruments being replaced with copies, entire collections disappearing into private hands without proper legal transfers. Elena studied the photographs, her excitement growing. You've been investigating this the whole time. I've been surviving. But survival requires understanding who your enemies are and how they operate. Marcus pulled out a specific photograph that showed the interior of a piano with documents visible inside the case. This was taken at a private auction house 6 months ago. Notice anything familiar about the authentication stamps? Elena looked closer and felt her pulse quicken. The stamps were identical to ones she had seen in her research on Ashford Galleries. They're using the same forger. The same network, Marcus corrected. Petrov, Kozlov, Ashford, and probably a dozen others. They're not just selling individual forged pieces, they're systematically looting and replacing entire collections. Elena sat back in her chair, processing the implications. We're not just talking about art fraud. We're talking about organized crime on an international scale. Marcus nodded grimly. And Victoria Ashford's gallery is their primary money laundering operation in Manhattan. Which means, Elena said slowly, that when we bring them down, we need to bring them all down simultaneously. Exactly. Half measures won't work against this kind of operation. We need evidence that's overwhelming, undeniable, and public enough that they can't buy their way out of consequences. Elena smiled, but it wasn't a pleasant expression. I've been planning something like that for 2 years. I just needed the right person to help me execute it. Marcus returned to his workbench and picked up a small device that Elena hadn't noticed before, a digital recording device disguised as a tuning fork. Ms. Rodriguez, I think it's time you learned exactly what I've been doing for the past 3 years. Over the next hour, Marcus showed Elena a collection that would have made any investigative journalist weep with joy. Hidden cameras disguised as musical instrument parts. Recording devices built into seemingly broken tools. Documentation systems that could capture financial transactions, authentication processes, and private conversations with crystal clarity. Dar. Chen, Elena said finally, you haven't just been surviving down here. You've been building the most sophisticated intelligence operation I've ever seen. Marcus smiled for the first time since she'd arrived. Ms. Rodriguez, when someone destroys your life, you have 2 choices, accept defeat, or spend every waking moment preparing for revenge. And you chose revenge. I chose justice. There's a difference, though the end result might look similar. Elena gathered her documents and closed her briefcase, but before leaving, she pulled out a business card and placed it on Marcus's work table. My contact information is all there. When you're ready to move forward, call me. Ms. Rodriguez? Marcus called as she reached the ladder. That exhibition opening next week at Ashford Galleries, what's the date? Thursday evening, 7 p.m. Why? Marcus turned back to his workbench, picking up a tool that gleamed like surgical steel in the emergency lighting. Because I think it's time Victoria Ashford learned the difference between dismissing someone and making an enemy. As Elena climbed back toward the surface world, she could hear the sound of Marcus working, precise, methodical, purposeful. The sound of a master craftsman preparing for the most important repair job of his life. Above ground, Manhattan continued its relentless pace, unaware that beneath the city, 2 very patient predators were finally ready to hunt. What moment in this chapter caught your attention the most? Was it discovering Marcus's underground intelligence operation, learning about the international art crime network, or realizing that his 3 years of hiding were actually 3 years of preparation? Drop a comment and let me know what made your blood boil with indignation at this systematic destruction of an innocent man's life. Thursday morning arrived with the crisp clarity that only October in Manhattan could provide. Victoria Ashford stood in her gallery's main room, surveying preparations for the evening's exhibition opening with the satisfaction of a general reviewing troops before battle. The Whitmore collection, 12 pieces of supposed Renaissance art that would net her operation nearly $3 million, hung in perfect alignment along the pristine white walls. What Victoria didn't know was that Pavel Kozlov's latest masterpieces were about to become evidence in the most public art fraud exposure in Manhattan history. James. Victoria's voice cut through the morning calm like a blade. The caterers need to understand that the champagne service begins at precisely 7:15, not 7:20. Timing is everything. James scurried past carrying clipboard and tablet, his nervous energy amplified by the pressure of hosting Manhattan's cultural elite. Tonight's guest list read like a directory of old money and new power, museum board members, private collectors, art critics whose opinions could make or destroy careers. Victoria moved to her prized Steinway, still silent after 3 weeks of neglect. The broken string had become an embarrassment, a visible flaw in her otherwise perfect gallery. She had finally swallowed her pride and contacted 3 different restoration services, but their quotes remained astronomical and their availability non-existent. Which was why, when Marcus Chen appeared at her gallery door at exactly 10 a.m., Victoria found herself in the uncomfortable position of needing something from someone she considered beneath her notice. Ms. Ashford, Marcus said, his voice carrying the same quiet dignity that had unsettled her during their first encounter. I understand you're still having difficulty with your piano repair. Victoria looked him up and down with renewed disdain. His clothes were clean but obviously second-hand, his shoes worn but polished. There was something different about his demeanor today, a calm confidence that suggested he knew something she didn't. Mr. Chen, as I explained before, this instrument requires professional attention. I'm sure you mean well, but I have references, Marcus interrupted, producing a folder from an old messenger bag. Previous work with similar instruments. Perhaps you'd like to review them before making a final decision. Victoria's eyebrows rose. The audacity was breathtaking, but her curiosity was piqued. She accepted the folder and opened it, expecting to find amateur testimonials or community center recommendations. Instead, she found documentation that made her blood run cold. The first reference letter was from Carnegie Hall's restoration department, praising the exceptional skill and artistry of Dr. Marcus Chen. The second was from Lincoln Center, detailing restoration work on instruments worth millions. The third was from the Metropolitan Museum's musical instrument collection, describing repairs that had exceeded all expectations. Victoria's hands began to tremble as she read. These weren't random references, these were testimonials from the most prestigious musical institutions in the world. But that was impossible. This man was clearly homeless, obviously destitute. How could someone with credentials like these be living on the streets? I don't understand, Victoria said, her voice losing its confident edge. If these references are authentic, why are you offering to work for $50? Marcus smiled, but there was no warmth in the expression. Sometimes circumstances change, Ms. Ashford. Sometimes people find themselves in situations they never expected. Victoria studied his face, searching for deception but finding only calm certainty. A terrible suspicion was beginning to form in her mind, the suspicion that she had made a catastrophic error in judgment. The broken string, Marcus continued, is actually the least of your piano's problems. From what I can hear, there's significant tension irregularity across the entire soundboard. Without proper attention, you're looking at complete structural failure within 6 months. The words hit Victoria like physical blows. Her Steinway was the centerpiece of her gallery, the instrument that impressed clients and demonstrated her cultural sophistication. The idea that it was slowly destroying itself was unthinkable. You can hear all of that without even opening it. Perfect pitch, Ms. Ashford. Combined with 40 years of experience working with instruments exactly like this one. Marcus paused, studying her expression. But perhaps you prefer to wait for one of those other repair services you mentioned. Victoria's mind raced through the implications. Tonight's exhibition opening was the most important event she had hosted in years. Having her centerpiece piano visibly broken would be humiliating enough, but the possibility of complete structural failure happening in front of Manhattan's cultural elite was terrifying. How long would the repair take, she asked, hating herself for the question. 4 hours for proper restoration. 2 if you just want the immediate problems fixed. Victoria checked her watch. The opening began at 7 p.m., which meant she had approximately 8 hours to make a decision. Every restoration service she had contacted was booked solid, and the few that claimed availability were quoting prices that made her wince even with her substantial profit margins. Fine, she said, the word tasting like ash in her mouth. But I want to be clear about something, Mr. Chen. This is a one-time arrangement based on emergency circumstances. I'll pay your $50, but I expect professional results. Marcus nodded slowly. Of course, Ms. Ashford. I understand completely. What Victoria didn't notice was the small device Marcus slipped from his pocket and activated, a recording device disguised as a vintage tuning fork. What she also didn't notice was the way his eyes catalogued every detail of the gallery's layout, the positioning of security cameras, and the location of the private office where she conducted her most sensitive business. I'll need access to the piano's interior, Marcus said. And I'll require adequate lighting and space to work. Victoria gestured toward the main gallery space. Whatever you need. James will assist you with any requirements. As Marcus began unpacking his tools, instruments that Victoria was beginning to realize were far more sophisticated than she had initially assumed, she retreated to her office to finalize preparations for the evening's event. What she didn't know was that Marcus had spent the previous 3 days conducting surveillance on her gallery, documenting the comings and goings of staff and clients, identifying security vulnerabilities, and mapping every inch of the building's layout. What she also didn't know was that Elena Rodriguez was positioned across the street in a rented office space, equipped with telephoto cameras and recording equipment, documenting every detail of the gallery's operations. And what she definitely didn't know was that the man she had just hired to repair her piano was about to conduct the most thorough and devastating investigation in the history of Manhattan art crime. Marcus began his work with the methodical precision of a surgeon. First, he carefully removed the Steinway's top board, exposing the instrument's internal mechanisms to full view. The broken string was immediately obvious, but as he had suspected, it was merely the most visible symptom of much larger problems. The piano's entire soundboard showed signs of stress fractures, indicating years of improper maintenance. The bridge was beginning to separate from the soundboard, which would eventually cause complete tonal collapse. Most telling of all, someone had been using the piano's interior as storage space. There were scratches and were patterns that suggested regular access to the instrument's hidden areas. As Marcus worked, he maintained a running commentary for the hidden recording devices he had placed throughout the gallery during his initial visit. Every observation was being documented with forensic precision. Interior damage consistent with regular unauthorized access, he murmured while adjusting a loose pin block. Foreign material residue suggests document storage within instrument cavity. 30 minutes into the repair process, Victoria's assistant James approached with obvious nervousness. "Excuse me, Mr. Chen. MS. Ashford would like to know how much longer you'll need." Marcus looked up from his work, noting that James was carrying a manila envelope marked Authentication Documents, Confidential. "Another hour for the essential repairs. Though I should mention, I've found some irregularities that MS. Ashford might want to address." "Irregularities?" Marcus pointed to the stress fractures in the soundboard. "Someone has been accessing this piano's interior regularly. The wear patterns suggest it's been used for storage purposes, which is extremely damaging to the instrument's structural integrity." James's face went pale. "Storage purposes? Documents, most likely. Small packages. The scratches and residue patterns are quite distinctive." Marcus continued working while speaking, but his tone was conversational, almost casual. "It's not uncommon in galleries that deal with high-value items. Sometimes people need secure places to store sensitive paperwork." The envelope in James's hands began to shake slightly. I should tell MS. Ashford about this. Of course. Though she may already be aware of the situation." As James hurried away, Marcus smiled grimly to himself. The first seed of panic had been planted. Now it was time to apply pressure systematically until the entire criminal operation collapsed under its own weight. 40 minutes later, Victoria herself approached the piano, her composure noticeably strained. "Mr. Chen, James mentioned something about storage damage." Marcus straightened up from his work, his hands covered in piano dust and metal polish. "Yes, significant interior wear from non-musical use. It's quite unusual, actually. Most piano owners are very careful about maintaining the interior environment." Victoria's smile looked painted on. "I can't imagine how that might have happened." "Well," Marcus said thoughtfully, "the wear patterns suggest regular document storage. Legal papers, authentication certificates, that sort of thing. Very damaging to the instrument, but I suppose some people prioritize convenience over preservation. The color drained from Victoria's face. Document storage. Oh yes, quite obvious once you know what to look for. The scratches on the frame, the chemical residue from ink and paper, the compression marks from repeated insertion and removal of materials. Marcus gestured to the piano's interior. I'd estimate someone has been using this space for document storage for at least 2 years, possibly longer. Victoria stared at the piano's exposed interior as if seeing it for the first time. Which, in a very real sense, she was. Is there any way to tell what kind of documents? Marcus smiled with the expression of someone who had just been asked exactly the right question. Funny you should ask, Ms. Ashford. I found something you might want to see. From the piano's interior, Marcus carefully extracted a small piece of paper that had been caught behind one of the support braces. He handed it to Victoria with the careful courtesy of someone returning lost property. Victoria's hands shook as she read what was printed on the paper fragment: Authentication Certificate, Partial, Renaissance Period Verification. The paper slipped from her fingers and drifted to the floor like a fallen leaf. Her carefully constructed world was beginning to collapse, and she could feel it happening in real time. Mr. Chen, she said, her voice barely above a whisper, I think there's been some sort of misunderstanding. Marcus nodded sympathetically. I'm sure there has, Ms. Ashford. There usually is. This is where everything starts to unravel. Can you see how Marcus is systematically dismantling Victoria's world with nothing but patience, precision, and perfect timing? Follow our channel for more stories about justice served cold and revenge delivered with surgical precision. Like this video if you're enjoying watching karma finally catch up with someone who truly deserves it. What happens next will leave you speechless. At 2:47 p.m., exactly 17 minutes after Marcus Chen had extracted the incriminating document fragment from Victoria Ashford's piano, Detective Sarah Martinez of the Manhattan Art Crime Unit received a phone call that would define the rest of her career. Detective Martinez? This is Elena Rodriguez, legal aid attorney. I believe I have information about an ongoing art fraud operation that requires immediate attention. Detective Martinez had been with the Art Crime Unit for 6 years, long enough to recognize the difference between amateur tip calls and genuine intelligence. Elena Rodriguez's voice carried the calm confidence of someone who knew exactly what they were talking about. Ms. Rodriguez, what kind of operation are we discussing? International art forgery and money laundering, centered at Ashford Galleries on East 78th Street. We have documentation, recorded evidence, and a witness currently inside the operation gathering real-time intelligence. Martinez sat forward in her chair. The Ashford Gallery had been on her radar for months, high-value transactions with questionable provenance, clients who preferred cash payments, and authentication processes that seemed unusually fast for the complexity of the pieces being verified. Ms. Rodriguez, I'm going to need you to come in immediately with whatever evidence you have. Detective, I'm afraid we don't have that luxury. The operation is reaching crisis point today. There's an exhibition opening tonight where they're planning to sell approximately $3 million worth of forged artwork to unsuspecting collectors. Martinez felt her pulse quicken. $3 million represented the kind of art fraud case that made careers and shut down international criminal networks. What kind of evidence are we talking about? Elena's voice was steady, professional. Financial records, authentication documents, recorded conversations, and photographic evidence of the forgery process. Plus testimony from Dr. Marcus Chen, former principal restorer for Carnegie Hall and Lincoln Center. The name stopped Martinez cold. Marcus Chen was a legend in art restoration circles, but he had disappeared from the professional world 3 years ago after a scandal involving damaged instruments. Most people assumed he had left the country in shame. Dar. Chen is your witness. Dar. Chen is our inside asset. He's currently conducting an authorized repair on the piano they've been using to hide their authentication documents. Martinez grabbed her coat and badge. Ms. Rodriguez, I'm dispatching a team to your location immediately. Do not, under any circumstances, attempt to confront these people directly. Detective, with respect, confrontation isn't our goal. Documentation is. 23 minutes later, Detective Martinez stood in Elena Rodriguez's temporary surveillance office across from Ashford Galleries, staring at evidence that would have taken her unit months to compile through traditional investigation methods. The walls were covered with photographs showing the comings and goings of known art criminals. Financial records detailed transactions that violated multiple federal statutes. Audio recordings captured conversations between Victoria Ashford, Pavel Kozlov, and other conspirators discussing authentication fraud, money laundering, and the systematic replacement of authentic pieces with forgeries. Ms. Rodriguez, Martinez said, studying a photograph that clearly showed Pavel Kozlov entering the gallery with a large wrapped package. How long have you been conducting this surveillance? 2 years of investigation, 3 weeks of active surveillance. But Dr. Chen has been gathering intelligence for much longer. Martinez examined a detailed floor plan of the gallery marked with security camera locations, staff schedules, and client traffic patterns. This is incredibly sophisticated work. Dr. Chen is an incredibly sophisticated man who was systematically destroyed by people with more money than conscience. Elena pointed to a series of financial records. Viktor Petrov, the Russian oligarch who orchestrated Chen's downfall, is a major investor in the Ashford operation. The revelation hit Martinez like a physical blow. The Petrov investigation had been ongoing for 2 years, with federal agencies trying to penetrate his various money laundering operations. If they could connect him to the Ashford forgery ring, it would provide the breakthrough they needed to bring down his entire network. Ms. Rodriguez, I need to contact federal authorities immediately. This is bigger than local art fraud. Elena smiled grimly. Detective, it gets bigger. She handed Martinez a thick folder marked International Connections. Inside were documents linking the Ashford operation to forgery networks in London, Paris, Hong Kong, and Moscow. The scope was breathtaking, not just individual art fraud, but systematic looting and replacement of cultural artifacts on a global scale. My God, Martinez whispered, studying shipping manifests that showed authentic pieces being sent to offshore storage facilities while forgeries entered the legitimate market. They're not just stealing art. They're stealing history. And tonight, they're planning their largest operation yet. The Whitmore collection represents pieces that will disappear into private hands forever if we don't stop this sale. Martinez pulled out her radio and contacted federal authorities, but even as she spoke, her eyes remained fixed on the gallery across the street. Through the large windows, she could see Marcus Chen working methodically at the piano, his movements precise and unhurried. Ms. Rodriguez, your inside asset, how much danger is he in? Dr. Chen has been planning this operation for 3 years. He's not in danger. He is the danger. Across the street, Marcus was conducting the most important restoration of his career. Not of the piano, that was merely cover for his real work. He was restoring justice to a system that had failed him, balance to a world that had been corrupted by greed, and dignity to his own destroyed reputation. The Steinway's broken string had been replaced within the first hour of work. The remaining time had been spent conducting forensic documentation of the gallery's criminal operations with scientific precision. Hidden in his toolkit were recording devices, cameras, and evidence collection materials that would have impressed federal investigators. Every conversation was being captured, every document photographed, every criminal transaction documented with legal-grade precision. At 3:15 p.m., Victoria Ashford approached the piano with obvious agitation. "Mr. Chen, I need to ask you to finish up as quickly as possible. We have preparations that require privacy." Marcus looked up from adjusting the piano's action, his expression mild and accommodating. "Of course, Ms. Ashford. I'll just need a few more minutes to calibrate the tension properly." What Victoria didn't realize was that Marcus had been listening to her increasingly frantic phone calls for the past hour. Calls to Pavel Kozlov demanding immediate removal of sensitive materials. Calls to offshore banks confirming wire transfer capabilities. Calls to private security firms inquiring about emergency document destruction services. "Actually," Marcus said, straightening up from his work, "there is something I should mention about the piano's interior." Victoria's face went white. "What about it?" "Well, during the restoration process, I discovered some items that had been stored inside the instrument. I took the liberty of placing them on your desk for safekeeping." Victoria's scream of rage echoed through the gallery like a shattering crystal. She ran toward her office, leaving Marcus alone with the piano and a small smile that would have terrified her if she had seen it. Because what Marcus had placed on Victoria's desk wasn't just the document fragments he had found in the piano. It was a complete inventory of every piece of evidence he had discovered, photographed, and documented over 3 weeks of surveillance. Financial records showing payments to known forgers. Authentication certificates with fraudulent signatures. Correspondence with offshore banking facilities. Shopping lists for art theft operations spanning 3 continents. And at the top of the pile, a handwritten note, "Ms. Ashford, you were right about getting what you pay for. Dar. Marcus Chen, former principal restorer, Carnegie Hall and Lincoln Center." Victoria's second scream was louder than the first, followed by the sound of expensive office furniture being overturned in panic. James appeared at Marcus's side, his face pale with terror. "Mr. Chen, I think you should leave. Now." Marcus calmly packed his tools, each movement deliberate and unhurried. "James, I wouldn't worry about me. I'd worry about finding a good employment attorney." "What do you mean?" "I mean, in about 10 minutes, this gallery is going to be swarming with federal agents. And anyone still on the premises is going to have some very difficult questions to answer." James dropped his clipboard and ran for the exit, leaving Marcus alone in the main gallery space. He walked to the Steinway and played a single, perfect middle C. The note resonated through the space with crystalline clarity, the sound of an instrument restored to its proper voice. Through the gallery windows, Marcus could see unmarked vehicles positioning themselves around the building. Detective Martinez and her federal counterparts were moving into place with military precision. Marcus played another note, this time a full chord that filled the gallery with rich, complex harmonies. The sound was magnificent, the culmination of decades of expertise and 3 years of patient planning. From her office came the sound of Victoria making increasingly desperate phone calls, each one more panicked than the last. "Pavel, you need to get here now. Everything is compromised." "No, I can't wait until tonight. The repair man found everything." "What do you mean, what repair man?" "The piano tuner I hired. He's some kind of expert." Marcus smiled and played a complex passage, something his grandfather had composed for this specific piano 80 years ago. The melody was haunting, beautiful, and perfectly appropriate for a funeral. Because Victoria Ashford's criminal enterprise was about to die, and Marcus Chen was playing its requiem. At exactly 3:30 p.m., Detective Martinez and 6 federal agents entered Ashford Galleries through both the front door and rear service entrance simultaneously. Victoria Ashford was found in her office, surrounded by partially shredded documents and speaking frantically into 3 different phones. Pavel Kozlov was apprehended in the basement, attempting to load forged paintings into a van through the building's service tunnel. And Marcus Chen was found at the piano, playing beautiful music for an audience of federal law enforcement officers who were about to witness the largest art fraud arrest in Manhattan history. Dr. Chen, Detective Martinez said as she approached the piano, "I believe we have some things to discuss." Marcus finished the piece he was playing, a perfect, haunting melody that seemed to echo long after the last note had faded, and turned to face the detective with the calm expression of someone whose 3-year plan had just reached its inevitable conclusion. "Detective Martinez," he said quietly, "I believe we do." Victoria Ashford's screams of outrage could be heard throughout the gallery as federal agents began reading her rights and inventorying evidence that would dismantle an international criminal network. But those screams were nothing compared to the sound that would follow, the sound of justice being served with surgical precision, and the sweet music of a master craftsman's perfect revenge. Federal agent Catherine Walsh had spent 15 years investigating white-collar crime, but she had never encountered evidence documentation as comprehensive as what Dr. Marcus Chen presented in the basement interrogation room of the FBI's Manhattan field office at 4:45 p.m. that Thursday afternoon. The conference table was covered with bankers' boxes, each labeled with surgical precision and containing materials that represented 3 years of methodical intelligence gathering. Agent Walsh opened the first box and found herself staring at a level of criminal documentation that would have taken her team months to compile through traditional investigation methods. Dr. Chen, Agent Walsh began, studying a photograph that showed Pavel Kozlov physically removing authentication seals from legitimate paintings. "You've been conducting what amounts to a federal investigation without federal authority." Marcus sat across from her with the calm demeanor of someone who had spent 3 years preparing for this exact moment. His hands, still bearing traces of piano polish from that morning's work, rested quietly on the table as he watched federal agents process evidence that would dismantle an international criminal network. "Agent Walsh, I've been documenting crimes that were being committed against me and others. Nothing more, nothing less." Elena Rodriguez, seated beside Marcus in her capacity as legal counsel, opened her briefcase and extracted a thick folder. "Agent Walsh, Dr. Chen's activities were conducted within the bounds of legitimate self-defense and citizen investigation. Every piece of evidence was gathered legally and ethically." Walsh examined a series of financial records showing wire transfers between Victoria Ashford's accounts and offshore banking facilities controlled by Viktor Petrov. The amounts were staggering, over $12 million in transactions spanning 18 months. Dr. Chen, walk me through how you obtained these financial records. Marcus leaned forward slightly, his voice carrying the professorial tone he had once used when lecturing at conservatory programs. "Agent Walsh, Victoria Ashford made a critical error when she chose to store sensitive documents inside her Steinway piano. She assumed that no one would ever have reason to access the instrument's interior." He pulled out a series of photographs showing the piano's internal mechanism and pointed to specific areas where document storage had left physical evidence. What she didn't realize was that hiding papers inside a piano leaves chemical traces, compression marks, and were patterns that are easily identifiable to someone with restoration experience. "So you were able to reconstruct what had been stored there?" "Better than that. I was able to access the current storage area." Marcus smiled with the satisfaction of someone revealing a masterstroke. Victoria never removed the documents from the piano. She simply assumed no one would ever look. Agent Walsh felt her pulse quicken. "You're telling me the evidence was still there when you performed the repair?" Elena answered for Marcus, pulling out a legal document. "Agent Walsh, Dr. Chen was hired by Victoria Ashford to perform legitimate piano restoration services. During the course of that work, he discovered evidence of criminal activity and immediately reported it to appropriate authorities. The documents were just sitting inside the piano." Marcus shook his head. "Not sitting. Hidden. But hidden by someone who didn't understand that musical instruments require complete internal access for proper maintenance." He opened a second evidence box, revealing hundreds of photographs that documented the systematic removal of authentic artwork from the gallery and its replacement with forged copies. Each photograph was time-stamped and included detailed technical analysis of the forgery techniques being employed. Dr. Chen, Agent Walsh said, studying images that showed Pavel Kozlov's workshop set up inside the gallery's basement. How did you gain access to photograph these operations? Agent Walsh, Ashford Galleries has 17 security cameras. What they don't have is anyone monitoring those cameras during off hours. The building's service tunnels connect to the subway maintenance system, and someone with knowledge of the underground infrastructure can move through the building undetected. Elena added, all of Dr. Chen's surveillance activities were conducted from public spaces or areas where he had legitimate access as a contracted service provider. Walsh opened a third evidence box and found herself looking at recorded conversations between Victoria Ashford, Pavel Kozlov, and multiple unidentified parties discussing art authentication fraud, money laundering, and the systematic theft of cultural artifacts. The recordings were crystal clear, professionally produced, and absolutely devastating to any defense the criminals might attempt. These recordings, Walsh said, playing back a conversation where Victoria explicitly discussed forging provenance documents, the audio quality is remarkable. Marcus reached into his toolkit and produced what appeared to be a standard tuning fork. Acoustic recording device. Custom built to record conversations while appearing to be a normal musical instrument tool. And you placed these throughout the gallery? I placed them in areas where I was conducting legitimate restoration work. Piano repair requires monitoring acoustic properties throughout the entire space. Agent Walsh paused the recording and looked directly at Marcus. Dr. Chen, this level of surveillance and evidence gathering, this wasn't improvised, was it? Agent Walsh, 3 years ago, Viktor Petrov destroyed my career, my reputation, and my life using fabricated evidence and corrupt investigators. I spent the first year being angry about the injustice. I spent the next 2 years learning how to document injustice so thoroughly that no amount of money or influence could make it disappear. Elena opened another folder, this one containing legal documentation. Agent Walsh, Dr. Chen has been working with our legal aid office for 18 months. Everything he's done has been conducted with proper legal oversight and constitutional compliance. Walsh studied the timeline Elena provided, noting that Marcus's investigation had been comprehensive, systematic, and entirely within legal bounds. More importantly, the evidence he had gathered was admissible, verifiable, and sufficient to secure convictions against multiple defendants. Dr. Chen, let me ask you directly, what is your ultimate goal here? Marcus was quiet for a moment, considering the question carefully. Agent Walsh, my goal is to restore balance. 3 years ago, criminals with money and influence destroyed an innocent man's life. Today, that same man is providing evidence to destroy their criminal operations. The system that failed me is now going to work exactly as it was designed to work. Revenge? Justice. There's a difference, though the end result might look similar. Agent Walsh opened the fourth and final evidence box, and immediately understood why Marcus had saved this material for last. Inside were documents that connected the Ashford Gallery operation to art theft networks spanning 4 continents. Museum inventories showing pieces that had been lost and later appeared in private collections. Shipping manifests documenting the movement of stolen cultural artifacts. Financial records showing payments to corrupt officials, forged authentication experts, and private security firms specializing in asset recovery. My God, Walsh whispered, studying documents that implicated cultural institutions, government officials, and private collectors across 3 time zones. This isn't just art fraud. This is systematic cultural theft on an international scale. Marcus nodded grimly. Agent Walsh, what you're looking at is evidence of crimes that have been ongoing for decades. The Ashford Gallery operation was just one node in a network that has stolen and replaced thousands of cultural artifacts worldwide. And Viktor Petrov is at the center of it all. Viktor Petrov is one of several people at the center. But yes, he's been coordinating operations between Moscow, London, New York, and Hong Kong for at least 10 years. Elena pulled out a final document, a comprehensive legal brief that outlined federal charges applicable to every person involved in the network. Wire fraud, money laundering, interstate transportation of stolen property, conspiracy to defraud, tax evasion, and violations of international cultural property laws. Agent Walsh, Elena said, we're prepared to provide full cooperation in exchange for Dr. Chen's complete exoneration from the charges that were fabricated against him 3 years ago. Walsh looked at the evidence spread across the conference table and realized she was looking at the most significant art crime bust in FBI history. The documentation was overwhelming, the criminal network was international in scope, and the evidence quality was better than anything her unit had ever produced through traditional investigation methods. Dr. Chen, M.S. Rodriguez, let me be very clear about something. The evidence you provided is sufficient to secure convictions against multiple defendants and dismantle a criminal network that spans multiple countries. The FBI will absolutely be pursuing full prosecution of everyone involved. Marcus smiled for the first time since entering the federal building. Agent Walsh, I was hoping you'd say that. But I have to ask, what happens to you now? You've spent 3 years living underground, planning this operation. When it's over, what do you do? Marcus looked at Elena, who nodded encouragingly. Agent Walsh, I'm hoping to return to my actual profession. There are a lot of damaged instruments in this world that deserve proper restoration. And the people who destroyed your life will be facing federal charges. Agent Walsh, the people who destroyed my life are about to discover that destroying someone's life and destroying someone's ability to fight back are two very different things. At that moment, Agent Walsh's radio crackled with an update from the field team at Ashford Galleries. Agent Walsh, we've arrested 6 individuals, seized 12 forged paintings, and recovered documents linking this operation to similar networks in 4 countries. We're going to need additional federal support for the international components of this investigation. Walsh smiled as she looked across the table at Marcus Chen, a man who had spent 3 years in an underground tunnel, planning the most sophisticated revenge operation in federal crime history. Dr. Chen, she said, I think you're going to get exactly the justice you've been working toward. Marcus nodded quietly. Agent Walsh, I was never working toward justice. Justice was always inevitable. I was just working to make sure it arrived with proper documentation. Outside the federal building, news vans were beginning to gather as word of the arrest spread through Manhattan's cultural community. The story would dominate headlines for weeks: international art theft network dismantled, millions in stolen cultural artifacts recovered, and the mysterious reappearance of Dr. Marcus Chen, the legendary restoration expert who had vanished 3 years earlier. But inside the FBI conference room, Marcus Chen sat quietly among boxes of evidence, listening to federal agents coordinate the largest art crime investigation in history, and finally, after 3 years, 2 months, and 16 days, allowing himself to believe that the nightmare was finally over. The piano in Ashford Galleries would eventually be returned to its rightful owners, the descendants of the Jewish family from whom it had been stolen during World War II. But not before Marcus Chen had the opportunity to restore it one final time, to tune it perfectly, and to play the piece his grandfather had composed for that specific instrument 80 years ago. The sound would be beautiful, haunting, and perfectly appropriate for a resurrection. At 6:30 p.m., exactly 30 minutes before the scheduled opening of what would have been the most lucrative art fraud operation in Manhattan history, Victoria Ashford found herself in federal custody, watching through reinforced glass as everything she had built crumbled with methodical precision. The scene outside Ashford Galleries resembled a controlled demolition. Federal agents moved through the building with surgical precision, cataloging evidence, photographing crime scenes, and systematically dismantling 3 years of criminal operations. News crews lined the street behind police barriers, their cameras capturing every moment of Victoria's spectacular fall from Manhattan's cultural elite to federal defendant. Detective Martinez stood in the gallery's main room, coordinating with federal agents as they processed what had become the crime scene of the decade. The pristine white walls that had once displayed millions of dollars in stolen art now bore evidence tags marking locations where forged paintings had hung. The climate-controlled environment that had preserved criminal evidence now preserved justice being served. Detective, Agent Walsh's voice came through Martinez's radio, "We need you in the basement. The forgery operation is even more extensive than we initially realized." Martinez descended to the gallery's lower level, where Pavel Kozlov's workshop had been hidden behind a false wall for over 2 years. The space was a master forger's dream laboratory. Professional-grade easels, centuries-old pigments, authentication equipment stolen from legitimate museums, and workstations for producing fake provenance documents with scientific precision. Pavel Kozlov sat in handcuffs, watching federal agents photograph his life's work with the expression of someone who had just realized that genius without legal boundaries was still just criminal behavior. His workshop contained evidence of forgeries spanning Renaissance paintings to modern sculptures, each one crafted with skill that would have been admirable if it hadn't been used to steal from collectors, museums, and cultural institutions worldwide. Kozlov, Agent Walsh said, approaching the forger with a thick evidence folder, "We've documented over 300 forged pieces produced in this workshop. That represents approximately $50 million in fraud over 3 years." Pavel looked up with the defiant arrogance of someone who still believed his artistic skill somehow justified his criminal behavior. "You have no idea the beauty I've created. These pieces are superior to many originals. Mr. Kozlov, your artistic skill is not in question. Your complete disregard for cultural property laws, however, is going to result in approximately 20 years in federal prison." The forger's defiance cracked slightly. 20 years. Agent Walsh opened the evidence folder and spread photographs across the workspace table. Each image showed a forged piece alongside documentation proving its fraudulent nature. Wire fraud, conspiracy to defraud, interstate transportation of stolen property, money laundering, and violations of international cultural property treaties. Your artistic talent has earned you a very long federal sentence. Meanwhile, 3 floors above in the gallery's private office, Victoria Ashford was learning that wealth and social position provided no protection against overwhelming criminal evidence. Federal prosecutor James Harrison sat across from her in the improvised interrogation space, surrounded by boxes of financial records that documented every illegal transaction she had conducted over the past 18 months. Ms. Ashford, Prosecutor Harrison began, opening a file that contained bank records showing wire transfers totaling over $12 million. "Let's discuss your financial relationship with Viktor Petrov." Victoria's expensive attorney, summoned from his Thursday evening yacht club dinner, attempted to maintain some semblance of legal defense. "My client has no comment regarding her legitimate business relationships." Harrison smiled and pulled out a recording device. "Ms. Ashford, perhaps you'd like to hear a conversation you had with Mr. Petrov on October 15, discussing the systematic replacement of authentic artwork with forged copies." The recording quality was crystal clear, professionally produced, and absolutely devastating. Victoria's voice filled the room as she explicitly discussed authentication fraud, money laundering protocols, and the coordination of stolen art sales with offshore banking facilities. "That recording is inadmissible," her attorney protested weakly. "It was obtained without proper warrants." "Actually," Harrison replied, "the recording was obtained by Dr. Marcus Chen during the course of legitimate piano restoration work that your client hired him to perform." Dr. Chen was acting within his rights to document criminal activity he observed during authorized access to the premises. Victoria's face went ashen as the full implications became clear. The piano repair man, he's some kind of federal agent? Dar. Marcus Chen is a private citizen who spent 3 years documenting the criminal network that destroyed his career. What you're hearing is the sound of justice being served with perfect pitch. Harrison played another recording, this one capturing Victoria's conversation with Pavel Kozlov about using her gallery's reputation to authenticate forged pieces for sale to unsuspecting collectors. The conversation was detailed, explicit, and legally devastating. Ms. Ashford, based on the evidence we've gathered, the federal government is prepared to file charges including conspiracy to defraud, wire fraud, money laundering, and interstate transportation of stolen property. These charges carry a potential sentence of 35 years in federal prison. Victoria's composure finally shattered completely. 35 years? That's impossible. I'm a respected member of Manhattan's cultural community. Ms. Ashford, you were a respected member of Manhattan's cultural community. Now you're a federal defendant facing decades in prison for systematic art fraud. Her attorney leaned forward desperately. Mr. Harrison, surely there's room for negotiation. My client has information about other operations, other individuals who might be of interest to federal investigators. Harrison consulted his notes. We're aware that your client has information about Viktor Petrov's broader operations. However, Dr. Chen's investigation has already provided us with evidence linking your client's operation to criminal networks in London, Paris, Hong Kong, and Moscow. Your client's cooperation, while appreciated, is not essential to our broader investigation. The words hit Victoria like physical blows. Not only had she been caught, but her criminal network had been so thoroughly documented that she had nothing left to bargain with. The man she had dismissed as a homeless street musician had systematically dismantled her entire life with scientific precision. In the gallery's main room, Marcus Chen stood before his grandfather's Steinway, playing a soft melody while federal agents worked around him. The piano had been tuned to perfection, its voice restored to the clarity and beauty it had possessed when his grandfather first crafted it in Shanghai 8 decades earlier. Detective Martinez approached the piano, fascinated by the calm demeanor of the man who had orchestrated the most sophisticated criminal investigation in her career. Dr. Chen, how does it feel to watch everything come together like this? Marcus finished the passage he was playing and looked up with the quiet satisfaction of someone whose 3-year plan had reached its inevitable conclusion. Detective Martinez, it feels like tuning a piano. You apply pressure systematically, you make precise adjustments, and eventually, everything finds its proper harmony. And Victoria Ashford? Ms. Ashford chose to treat people as disposable. Now she's discovering that actions have consequences, even for people who believe themselves above accountability. Through the gallery windows, they could see news crews broadcasting live updates on the arrests. The story was already being described as the largest art fraud bust in New York history, with international implications that would reverberate through cultural institutions worldwide. Marcus played another chord, this one complex and beautiful, filled with the kind of musical sophistication that spoke to decades of training and an almost supernatural understanding of acoustic properties. Dr. Chen, Martinez asked, what happens to you now? Marcus smiled and closed the piano lid gently, his work finally complete. Detective, I return to my actual profession. There are a lot of damaged instruments in this world that deserve proper restoration. And the people who framed you 3 years ago? Viktor Petrov and his associates are about to discover that destroying someone's career and destroying someone's ability to plan revenge are two very different things. At that moment, Agent Walsh's radio crackled with an update that made everyone in the gallery stop what they were doing. Agent Walsh, we've just arrested Viktor Petrov at JFK Airport attempting to board a flight to Moscow. He was carrying forged documents and approximately $2 million in bearer bonds. Homeland Security is reporting that his arrest has triggered coordinated raids in London, Paris, and Hong Kong. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the distant sound of traffic and news helicopters circling overhead. Marcus Chen stood quietly beside his grandfather's piano, watching through the gallery windows as federal agents led Victoria Ashford toward a waiting vehicle in handcuffs. Her expensive suit was wrinkled, her perfect hair disheveled, her social confidence completely shattered. 3 years earlier, she had dismissed him as beneath her notice, someone whose offers of help could be rejected without consequence. Now she was learning that some mistakes echo long after the final note has been played. Detective Martinez, Marcus said quietly, justice isn't about revenge. It's about restoration. Today, we restored balance to a system that had been corrupted by people who believed money could rewrite reality. As Victoria Ashford was placed in the back of a federal vehicle, her eyes met Marcus's through the gallery window. The recognition was immediate and devastating, the understanding that the homeless man she had treated with casual cruelty was actually the architect of her complete destruction. Marcus nodded politely, the same courteous gesture he had offered when she first dismissed his services 3 days earlier. But this time, the gesture carried the weight of perfect justice, delivered with surgical precision by someone who had spent 3 years tuning his revenge to absolute perfection. The federal vehicle disappeared into Manhattan traffic, carrying Victoria Ashford toward a future that included decades in federal prison, financial ruin, and the complete destruction of everything she had built through criminal enterprise. Behind her, in the gallery that had once been her kingdom, Marcus Chen began packing his tools with the satisfied efficiency of someone whose work was finally complete. The piano was perfectly tuned. Justice had been perfectly served. And the music that emerged from both was absolutely beautiful. The federal courthouse on Foley Square buzzed with activity on a crisp November morning, 3 weeks after what media outlets had dubbed the piano justice case. Assistant U.S. Attorney Sarah Hendricks stood before Judge Patricia Williams in courtroom 15A, presenting evidence that would dismantle one of the most sophisticated art fraud networks in international criminal history. Marcus Chen sat in the gallery section, no longer the homeless street musician who had performed outside museums but not yet fully transformed back into the renowned restoration expert he had once been. His testimony over the past 2 weeks had been methodical, devastating, and absolutely unshakable under cross-examination. Your Honor, Attorney Hendricks addressed the court, the evidence presented demonstrates a criminal conspiracy spanning 3 years, 4 countries, and involving the theft and fraudulent sale of cultural artifacts valued at over $80 million. Judge Williams reviewed the extensive documentation spread across her bench. Financial records, recorded conversations, photographic evidence, and expert testimony had painted a picture of systematic criminal enterprise that reached from Manhattan galleries to Moscow oligarchs. Ms. Hendricks, the court has reviewed Dr. Chen's evidence compilation, and I must say it represents the most comprehensive criminal investigation I've encountered in 23 years on the federal bench. In the defendant's section, Victoria Ashford sat beside her court-appointed attorney, her designer suits replaced by standard prison attire. The woman who had once commanded Manhattan's cultural elite now faced the reality of federal sentencing guidelines that would keep her incarcerated well into her 60s. Pavel Kozlov occupied the defendant's table beside her, his artistic genius finally receiving the kind of detailed attention he had always craved, unfortunately from federal prosecutors documenting his crimes rather than art critics praising his skill. Your Honor, Victoria's attorney made a final attempt at damage control. My client was manipulated by more sophisticated criminal elements. She was essentially a victim of Viktor Petrov's broader conspiracy. Judge Williams consulted the evidence record. Counselor, the recorded conversations between your client and Mr. Petrov demonstrate active participation in criminal planning, not victimization. Your client explicitly discussed forging authentication documents, laundering proceeds through offshore accounts, and systematically defrauding collectors. Attorney Hendricks stood to present the prosecution's sentencing recommendation. Your Honor, Victoria Ashford served as the primary money laundering operation for an international art theft network. Her gallery provided legitimacy for the sale of stolen and forged cultural artifacts. The prosecution recommends 28 years imprisonment followed by supervised release. The number hung in the courtroom air like a death sentence. Victoria's composure finally cracked completely, and she began sobbing as the full implications became clear. 28 years would destroy everything: her social position, her business empire, her carefully constructed identity as Manhattan's cultural arbiter. And Mr. Kozlov? Your Honor, Pavel Kozlov's forgery operation produced over 300 fraudulent pieces, many of which replaced authentic artwork in private collections. The prosecution recommends 22 years imprisonment. Judge Williams reviewed the sentencing guidelines carefully. Mr. Kozlov, your artistic skill is not in question. However, your decision to use that skill for systematic fraud has earned you the court's severest punishment. Pavel looked up from the defendant's table with the broken expression of someone who had finally realized that talent without ethics was simply criminal behavior with sophisticated execution. Ms. Ashford, Judge Williams continued, your position as a gallery owner gave you access to collectors who trusted your expertise. You violated that trust systematically and used your reputation to authenticate fraudulent artwork. The court sentences you to 25 years in federal prison, followed by 10 years supervised release. Victoria's scream of anguish echoed through the courtroom as bailiffs moved to escort her back to federal detention. The woman who had once dismissed Marcus Chen's $50 offer as insulting was now facing a quarter-century in prison because of evidence he had gathered with $50 recording devices and salvaged equipment. Mr. Kozlov, the court sentences you to 20 years in federal prison, followed by 5 years supervised release. As the defendants were led away, Marcus Chen stood quietly in the gallery section, watching justice being served with the same methodical precision he had once applied to piano restoration. Elena Rodriguez sat beside him, both witnessing the culmination of 3 years of patient investigation and legal preparation. Dar. Chen, Elena whispered, how does it feel to watch them face consequences? Marcus considered the question carefully. Ms. Rodriguez, it feels like tuning. You apply pressure systematically until everything finds its proper harmony. But the courthouse proceedings were only the beginning of the cleanup process. Outside in the November morning, Manhattan's cultural community was reckoning with revelations that had shattered assumptions about authenticity, expertise, and trust. The Metropolitan Museum had quietly begun re-evaluating pieces in their collection that had any connection to the Ashford Gallery network. Private collectors who had purchased artwork through Victoria's authentication were facing the devastating possibility that their million-dollar acquisitions were sophisticated forgeries. Insurance companies were preparing for claims that would total hundreds of millions of dollars as the full scope of the fraud became clear. Legal firms specializing in art recovery were overwhelmed with clients seeking to determine whether their collections contained authentic pieces or Pavel Kozlov's masterful fakes. Meanwhile, in a restored workshop space in Lower Manhattan, no longer an underground tunnel but a legitimate business address, Marcus Chen was rebuilding his professional life with the same methodical patience he had applied to documenting criminal behavior. The workshop smelled of wood polish and metal cleaners, familiar scents that had been absent from his life for 3 years. Piano restoration tools hung from pegboards with surgical organization. Workbenches held instruments in various stages of repair, each one receiving the kind of attention that had once made Marcus Chen legendary in restoration circles. Elena visited the workshop on a Thursday afternoon, finding Marcus carefully adjusting the action on a 1890s Bosendorfer that belonged to a collector who had specifically requested his services after following the news coverage of the art fraud case. Dar. Chen, The phones have been ringing constantly. Carnegie Hall wants to discuss bringing you back as principal restorer. Lincoln Center is interested in consulting arrangements. The Smithsonian has called 3 times about their historical instrument collection. Marcus looked up from his work, considering the offers carefully. Ms. Rodriguez, 3 years ago I thought my career was over because people with money and influence could rewrite reality. Now I understand that reality has a way of reasserting itself, given sufficient time and proper documentation. Elena smiled and pulled out a thick envelope. Speaking of documentation, the Justice Department has completed their review of your original case. Viktor Petrov's confession included details about framing you for the errored piano damage. All charges against you have been formally dismissed, and there's discussion about compensation for the damage to your reputation. Marcus accepted the envelope but didn't open it immediately. Ms. Rodriguez, the compensation I needed was watching Victoria Ashford realize that dismissing people has consequences. Everything else is just paperwork. And Viktor Petrov? Mr. Petrov is facing extradition to 3 countries that want to prosecute him for art theft, money laundering, and cultural property violations. His legal problems will outlive him. Elena examined the Bosendorfer that Marcus was restoring, noting the precision and care he applied to every adjustment. Dar. Chen, what happens next? Marcus returned to his work, his hands moving across the piano's action with the fluid expertise that had made him famous before criminal conspiracy had destroyed his reputation. Ms. Rodriguez, I rebuild instruments that have been damaged by time, neglect, or deliberate harm. I return them to their proper voice so they can make beautiful music again. And yourself? Marcus smiled, the first genuinely peaceful expression Elena had seen from him since their initial meeting in the subway tunnel. I restore myself the same way I restore pianos. Methodically, patiently, and with absolute attention to detail. Outside the workshop, Manhattan continued its relentless pace, but the cultural community was operating under new assumptions about trust, authenticity, and accountability. Gallery owners were implementing more rigorous authentication processes. Private collectors were demanding additional verification for high-value acquisitions. Insurance companies were requiring enhanced documentation for art transactions. The Ashford Gallery building had been sold to cover legal fees and victim restitution. The space that had once housed millions of dollars in stolen artwork now stood empty, awaiting renovation into legitimate commercial space. Victoria Ashford's Steinway piano had been returned to the descendants of the Jewish family from whom it had been stolen during World War II. Marcus had been asked to perform the final restoration, tuning the instrument to the same specifications his grandfather had originally crafted 80 years earlier. The ceremony had been small, private, and profoundly moving. As Marcus played the piece his grandfather had composed specifically for that piano, 3 generations of a family finally heard their stolen heritage restored to its proper voice. The music was beautiful, complex, and perfectly appropriate for a reunion that had taken 8 decades to achieve. In federal prison, Victoria Ashford spent her first months learning that wealth and social position provided no protection against the reality of incarceration. Her cell was small, her schedule was regimented, and her former life as Manhattan's cultural arbiter was reduced to memories that grew more distant each day. Pavel Kozlov found himself in a different kind of prison, one where his artistic genius was acknowledged but utterly useless. His forgery skills, once worth millions in criminal markets, now earned him 43 cents per hour in the prison's art therapy program. But in Lower Manhattan, in a workshop that smelled of wood polish and new beginnings, Marcus Chen was making beautiful music again. Not just from the instruments he restored, but from the sound of justice served with perfect pitch and a life rebuilt with methodical precision. The cleanup was complete. The restoration was perfect. And the music that emerged was absolutely sublime. 6 months after the arrests, on a warm spring morning in Manhattan, Marcus Chen stood on the concert stage of Carnegie Hall, his hands resting on the keys of a restored 1925 Steinway Model D that sang with crystalline perfection. The audience, filled with musicians, critics, and cultural luminaries, had come to witness something unprecedented, the return of a master craftsman who had been destroyed by criminals and rebuilt himself through methodical pursuit of justice. The concert was officially titled, Restoration, Music from Recovered Instruments, but everyone understood its true significance. This was Marcus Chen's vindication, his resurrection, and his triumphant return to the world that had cast him out 3 years earlier. In the audience, Elena Rodriguez sat in the front row, watching her friend and client perform music on instruments he had personally restored from the wreckage of criminal enterprise. Each piano had been recovered from the art fraud network, authenticated, and returned to its rightful owners before being prepared for this extraordinary performance. Federal Judge Patricia Williams occupied a box seat, having specifically requested attendance at the concert that represented the final chapter of the most significant art crime case in her judicial career. Beside her sat Assistant U.S. Attorney Sarah Hendricks and Detective Martinez, watching justice conclude with beauty rather than punishment. Marcus began with a piece his grandfather had composed in Shanghai in the 1940s, a haunting melody that had been lost for decades before being discovered in the hidden compartment of Victoria Ashford's stolen Steinway. The music filled Carnegie Hall with complex harmonies that spoke to survival, patience, and the inevitable triumph of truth over deception. As he played, Marcus thought about the journey that had brought him to this moment. 3 years living underground, planning meticulously, documenting systematically, and waiting for the perfect opportunity to expose the criminals who had destroyed his life. The process had required the same skills he applied to piano restoration, infinite patience, precise attention to detail, and absolute commitment to perfection. In federal prison in Pennsylvania, Victoria Ashford listened to a radio broadcast of the concert on a small transistor radio in the prison library. The irony was devastating. The homeless man she had dismissed with casual cruelty was now performing at Carnegie Hall while she served year 2 of a 25-year sentence. Her appeals had been exhausted. Her assets had been liquidated to pay restitution to defrauded collectors. Her reputation as Manhattan's cultural arbiter had been replaced by notoriety as the architect of one of history's largest art fraud conspiracies. The woman who had once commanded 7-figure art transactions now worked in the prison laundry for 67 cents per hour, her manicured hands replaced by calloused fingers that smelled perpetually of industrial detergent. Pavel Kozlov occupied a federal facility in Colorado, where his artistic genius had been channeled into teaching basic drawing classes to inmates seeking their GEDs. The master forger who had once fooled international experts now helped convicted felons learn to sketch still-life compositions with pencil stubs and recycled paper. His forgery skills, once worth millions in criminal markets, were now historical curiosities studied by FBI art crime specialists as examples of technical mastery applied to criminal enterprise. His greatest works hung in evidence storage, forever marked with federal seizure tags that would never be removed. But the greatest fall belonged to Viktor Petrov, the Russian oligarch whose criminal network had spanned 4 continents and generated hundreds of millions in illicit profits. His assets had been frozen by international authorities. His art collection had been seized and was being systematically returned to museums and private owners from whom it had been stolen. Petrov himself faced extradition battles in multiple countries, each seeking to prosecute him for crimes ranging from art theft to money laundering to cultural property violations. His legal fees had consumed his remaining liquid assets, and his network of criminal associates had dissolved as federal investigations spread across international borders. The man who had destroyed Marcus Chen's life to satisfy his ego had lost everything while Marcus rebuilt his reputation one perfectly tuned instrument at a time. As the first movement of the concert concluded, Marcus looked out at the audience and saw something that would have been impossible 3 years earlier: respect, admiration, and recognition of his extraordinary talent. The standing ovation was genuine, sustained, and deeply moving. During the intermission, Elena joined Marcus backstage in the artist's green room. Dar. Chen, how does it feel to be back where you belong? Marcus adjusted his formal concert attire, clothing that represented his return to professional dignity after 3 years of wearing salvaged garments. Ms. Rodriguez, it feels like completing a very complex restoration. You apply pressure systematically, you make precise adjustments, and eventually, everything finds its proper harmony. Elena smiled and handed him an envelope marked with the seal of the State Department. Dar. Chen, there's something I think you should see. Marcus opened the envelope and found an official letter informing him that several international museums had requested his expertise for major restoration projects. The Louvre wanted him to evaluate instruments damaged during the Nazi occupation. The British Museum needed consultation on pieces recovered from private collectors. The Hermitage in St. Petersburg, ironically, required assistance with instruments whose authenticity had been questioned after the Petrov investigation. Ms. Rodriguez, they want me to help clean up the mess that my own case exposed. Dar. Chen, they want the world's foremost expert in instrument authentication to help restore cultural heritage that has been damaged by systematic criminal enterprise. Your experience, both professional and personal, makes you uniquely qualified to distinguish between authentic cultural artifacts and sophisticated fakes. Marcus studied the letters carefully, noting that the proposed fees would have been astronomical 3 years earlier and were now simply appropriate compensation for expertise that had been proven under the most demanding circumstances possible. And the people who destroyed my life. Elena consulted her notes. Victoria Ashford will be eligible for parole in 2045. Pavel Kozlov has a possible release date of 2041. Viktor Petrov is facing charges in 4 countries that could result in consecutive sentences totaling over 60 years. Marcus nodded thoughtfully. They chose to treat people as disposable. Now they're learning that actions have consequences, even for people who believe money makes them untouchable. As the intermission concluded, Marcus returned to the stage for the concert's second half. The piece he had chosen was particularly meaningful, a complex composition that required not just technical skill but deep emotional understanding of musical architecture. As his hands moved across the keys with fluid precision, Marcus reflected on the mathematical beauty of justice properly served. Victoria Ashford had dismissed his $50 service offer as insulting. The cost of her criminal trial had exceeded $3 million, paid by taxpayers who deserved better from their cultural institutions. Pavel Kozlov had believed his artistic genius justified criminal behavior. His forgery skills were now studied by federal investigators as examples of talent corrupted by greed rather than elevated by purpose. Viktor Petrov had destroyed an innocent man's life to protect his criminal enterprises. His network was now completely dismantled, his assets seized, and his freedom permanently forfeited. But Marcus Chen, the man they had tried to erase, was performing at Carnegie Hall while they counted days in federal custody. The final movement of the concert built to a crescendo that filled the hall with sound so beautiful that several audience members wept openly. The music spoke to redemption, restoration, and the inevitable triumph of truth over systematic deception. As the last note faded and the audience rose in sustained ovation, Marcus looked out at the crowd and understood that his 3-year plan had achieved something beyond mere revenge. He had restored not just his own reputation, but public faith in the possibility that justice could be served even against criminals with vast resources and political connections. The applause continued for nearly 10 minutes, a recognition not just of musical excellence but of moral courage under extraordinary circumstances. Later that evening, at the reception following the concert, Marcus stood surrounded by offers that would rebuild his career to heights he had never previously imagined. Museums wanted his expertise. Collectors sought his authentication services. Recording companies proposed projects that would document his restoration techniques for future generations. Elena approached him with a final envelope, this one containing a check from the Justice Department's Victim Compensation Fund. Dar. Chen, this represents the government's recognition that you were systematically wronged by criminal conspiracy. The amount reflects not just lost income but acknowledgement of the extraordinary service you provided to federal law enforcement. Marcus looked at the check and smiled. The amount was substantial, enough to establish the finest instrument restoration workshop in North America. But more important than the money was what it represented, official acknowledgement that justice had been served and injustice had been corrected. Ms. Rodriguez, what happens now? Elena smiled and gestured toward the reception crowd, filled with people eager to work with the man whose patience and precision had exposed international criminal conspiracy. Dar. Chen, now you get to do what you've always done. You restore beautiful things that have been damaged by time, neglect, or deliberate harm. You return them to their proper voice so they can make beautiful music again. Marcus nodded and walked to a restored piano positioned near the reception area. He played a single, perfect note, middle C, the same note that had been broken in Victoria Ashford's Steinway 6 months earlier. The sound resonated through the reception space with crystalline clarity, the voice of an instrument restored to perfect harmony. As the note faded, Marcus Chen looked out at his rebuilt life and understood that some forms of music are worth waiting 3 years to hear properly. Justice had been served. Balance had been restored. And the music that emerged from both was absolutely perfect. In federal prison, Victoria Ashford would spend the next 23 years learning that dismissing someone and making an enemy are two very different things. But in Manhattan, in the world of legitimate cultural institutions and authentic artistic expression, Marcus Chen continued making beautiful music on instruments restored to their proper voice. The lesson was clear: some people fuck around. And some people ensure they find out. The finding out, when properly orchestrated, sounds remarkably like justice being served in perfect pitch.